Welcome to the Tomorrow Maker podcast, where we explore how we learn, live, work, and play now and in the future. I'm Summer Beatty.
And I'm Carlos Ramos. Hey, Summer. How you doing?
Hey, I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing great. Fantastic guest again today.
We're so lucky, aren't we, to have all of these amazing resources right at our fingertips.
We are. You just keep nailing, winner after winner after winner here. So who do we have?
We have Dawn Dickey, and she's our Director of Disability and Access Resources here at Penn College.
Now, what I like about this one, for those that have been listening to the Penn College podcast, we know we've got a lot of listenership within the Penn College community. So this one is really directed at the Penn College community. However, a lot of the messaging that's in here is also applicable to, we were trying to figure out what audience, and you just said everyone.
It is everyone. Oh my goodness. She talks about communication, inclusivity, just meeting people where they are. And I think it applies to everyone.
Yeah, I think when I think of just how everyone approaches their life, we all have some sort of obstacle that we might be dealing with. Some of us more than others, and that's where disability and access resources can step in for a student, for those who have very particular struggles, identifiable struggles, and it is really about self-identification too. So that itself is an obstacle to where, someone has to take that step on their own. And so I think this is where parents and teachers and others that are part of a young person's life can help them think about how they, do reach out for that help. And maybe it's not because of, that really easy to see, disability or barrier or obstacle. I mean, we all have something that we, have that need for sometime. And I think that Dawn does a really good job of talking through that.
Oh, she does. We need to advocate for ourselves, right?
That's right.
Okay. Well, here we go.
Tomorrow Makers.
Enjoy. Welcome. We are here with Dawn Dickey, Director of Disability and Access Resources. We're really excited to have you with us today.
It's so great to be here. I appreciate the invitation to come over and be able to speak to all of you. So it's very exciting to be able to come over and share a little bit of my background and where I am and what we do.
Awesome. And this is your first podcast, you said.
This is my first podcast experience. I've never done anything quite like this, so it's going to be new territory for me. I might need your assistance in guiding me throughout this podcast.
I think you're going to be a pro by the end. I have confidence.
I appreciate that, definitely.
All right. Well, let's get started. I'm just curious if you want to start. You could share a little bit with our listeners about your role as the Director of Disability and Access Resources and maybe how you came into that role.
Absolutely. So having a profound hearing loss since birth, I have my own disability, and so it allowed me to experience ups and downs in life. And, throughout that journey, I've really learned the importance of determination, problem solving, creativity, finding different avenues of how you can overcome obstacles, that you might experience. So that has really led me to having a passion to work with individuals with disabilities who may be experiencing some similar life journeys and to be able to offer support to those students. So I've worked with Disability and Access Resources the last 15 years, and we have an awesome team who is just as motivated and working with students as I am. Really, the mission of the office is really just working collectively with administration, staff, students in finding creative solutions to really make sure that all of our programs, services, the entire campus is accessible and inclusive for individuals with disabilities.
That's amazing. I would imagine you can relate very well with the students and have a great rapport with our community.
Oh, definitely. I think it definitely helps. Oftentimes, I really focus on, listening to students, letting them share with me, what they're experiencing, what barriers, may be coming up. But I think it's also, I think in my mind as I'm listening to students, my own personal experiences, and I can use that to kind of, provide some insight or advice, giving some guidance on how they want to pursue that barrier. I think in turn it kind of helps me establish connections with students because we're on the same page and we understand each other at that level.
I think one thing I found fascinating as I learned more about what your department does, initially people think, okay, there are the maybe more obvious things where it's someone with a hearing impairment, they work with your group, but what about those long or those short-term things that may come up? Like, I injured my leg, I'm just wondering if you could give us kind of a view of what all your office handles, like what all types of situations you may address.
Absolutely. So I think one of the phrases that I use quite often is anybody can experience a barrier at any point in time in their life. So that's one thing I always encourage, especially students, because that's the population that we work with, that while they're here at their college, really being mindful about the services and supports that are available, that even temporary disabilities for a broken arm or a broken leg. We have a lot of skateboarders on our campus. And so, in those situations, there may be new barriers that you're experiencing. So knowing that there are some resources and supports, even if it's on a temporary basis. Our largest population is really a lot of invisible disabilities. So learning disabilities, ADD, ADHD, even mental health diagnosis. So we have a wide spectrum of individuals that we offer support and guidance to. But I think that's one idea to think about is anybody can really experience barriers at any time. And so we always really encourage individuals to come talk to us and, we can see what kinds of supports and services may be available for you. I think in our world, we really focus a lot on what the barrier is that's a result of a diagnosis and how we can help a student overcome that barrier, whether that's with a specific accommodation, maybe academic kinds of accommodations, note-taking or testing accommodations. Maybe it's audio recording lecture, maybe just having a seat in the classroom that you feel works best for you. It could also be, just working with students on specific strategies to help them overcome barriers. So organization, time management, those are really essential skills in being a student. So we're really helping students to help, establish some of those skills to really address some of the coursework that they have in their programs. So really, I think it's a mix of accommodation, support services. Our office, we do offer ongoing support. So every student who's registered will be assigned a staff person to work with. So we work with that student, and depending on their needs, it might be meeting every other week, maybe it's every week, maybe it's once a month. But we just check in with them and see how we can support them and how things are going. And so that's one approach that our office takes that I really appreciate. Myself having a disability, things can change instantly. And you might have new needs that you didn't have a month ago. And so being able to have somebody that you can talk those through with is really important.
And it's so great that we have you here to do that. I see so many students. I teach part-time on top of what I'm doing here at the college, and see so many students that, like, if they just could reach out for help, and you try to press them to go get that help. But I think there's, I think back to when I was that age too, and being a Gen Xer, I'm just like, no, it didn't matter what you did. You just, you sucked it up and you did it on your own. It's like, but I think this generation is better about seeking help. But I think regardless of where we're coming from, we could all do a whole lot better job of seeking that out and asking for it. What do you see from our student body when it comes to being comfortable to reach out for that help? And then I'm thinking about that skateboard incident, because I'm like I had somebody who actually hurt himself pretty good. And I'm like, God, I didn't even think about offering that as a service to say, hey, why don't you go over to this office? Maybe they could figure out something to, because I saw he was kind of a little bummed. He was, not getting around like he wanted to. And
I think that, you bring up a really great point. Like, there's a lot of stereotypes, stigma surrounding, disabilities. And so one of the biggest challenges that we find maybe students who might be reluctant to seek out services and supports because they might feel that they're different from other people and, they want to be the same. And so that's something that we do experience. And I usually do encourage and bring awareness to those students to explain that basically accommodations and supports level the playing field. So that's actually going to bring you to the same level as all the other students, which is really important, aspect to think about, that you're going to be able to put your true potential and effort forward at that point. And the other part of it is that accommodations, if they are in place for you, you have control over how and when you use those accommodations. So, some students, may have testing accommodations, but maybe they feel they're very strong with history. And for their history exams, maybe they don't need testing accommodations. But on the other side, maybe math is something that they struggle with. So they might decide they want to use their testing accommodations for their math class. So the benefit of getting registered with our office and having them available for you, they're there when you need them. And I think that's a really important aspect to consider. And one thing, I have a little bit of a comparison. Everyone experiences barriers in their life. We all have strengths and weaknesses, whether you have a disability or not. So if we think about astronauts, there's no way we would be on the moon if we had not explored how we can develop equipment and specialized tools and suits that really helped us address the barriers of getting on the moon. So that's kind of how I see a lot of assistive technology, things that are going to help those with disabilities. By using those tools and resources, you're going to have access, you're going to have equal opportunity to do these things that you might not otherwise be able to, do. So I think really looking at it as an equal level playing field and just providing equal opportunity. And I think really what's important is for students to feel empowered to use those services and supports. So I think for the campus community, anything that we can do to create a welcoming and inclusive environment so students do feel empowered to use those kinds of resources when they need.
Absolutely. Otherwise, we're missing out on the great things that everyone has to bring to the table to move society and culture forward.
I was wondering if the use of your services have increased over the years. And maybe it's my perspective, but it almost seems like there's been less stigma over the years, especially if we consider what we've all gone through with COVID. Am I right? I see you shaking your head.
We have seen an increase in the number of students registered with our office. Actually, I just ran some numbers, and we had an 11% increase in the number of students registered with our office last fall than we did the fall before.
Wow.
So there's definitely data there demonstrating that more and more students are registering and, taking advantage of the services and the supports that we have to offer. I do feel that, our community is becoming more aware and understanding. And, I think for my own disability back in the day, there were a lot of barriers that I experienced that I wouldn't expect to see today, but just because of more awareness and technology has made wonderful strides. When I was growing up, even when I was well into my college age years, I never really was able to go to a movie theater and enjoy and actually understand a movie because technology back then, the captioning just wasn't something that was really doable in the movie theaters. But today, there's so many options for captioning at the movie theater, so I'm able to go to the movies, which is really awesome. We go with my family, and one of the things that I've never really thought about before, I knew I was missing out on the movie, but I never realized I missed out on a genuine conversation with my kids after the movie because I had no idea what the movie was about. I was seeing all the visual effects, but I was missing the story, behind it. And so the first time I saw a movie with captions, I was like, oh my gosh, I can join the conversation with my kids. And, so it just really, it's not only just having access to the content or the material, but it's to allow you to fully have a seat at the table and interact and engage with other people And I think that's something that's not always thought about. I didn't even realize it myself that I was missing out on that until it actually dawned on me that, yeah, I was never able to contribute to that conversation. So I think that's another important aspect of using accommodations and accessibility and really where we are today. There's so much great technology out there that really helps with that.
That example of the movie theater is so powerful. I was thinking too, I mean, there's something about just being in the space with someone at the same time and feeling the way it feels to just be with your family and to look over and, see them laughing and just, so it's, knowing the storyline, but also feeling what they're feeling at the same time.
Absolutely. And I think we connect with each other through emotions.
Sure.
And so that was a part that was really, lacking. I was looking over to see my kids laughing, but, it wasn't until, I'm actually understanding the movie and have a really good kind of like an emotional connection example of that. When I was young, I used to watch the movie Bambi all the time. All the time. I knew how that movie played out by, watching it. But I never realized that the mother was shot in the movie because it wasn't on the screen to visually see.
Ooh.
It was the sound of a gunshot. So it wasn't until that movie was captioned that I realized he wasn't just lost. He didn't lose his mom. The mom actually died. Somebody shot her. But I didn't realize it until the movie was captioned. That was many years later.
Were you heartbroken when you found out?
Yeah, I cried.
Yes.
And my mom, she's trying to figure out, you watch this movie all the time. Why are you just now crying? I never realized the mom died.
Oh, my goodness.
Yes.
Wow. When you said you kept watching it, I thought, well, this is interesting. That's such a sad movie. What does that say about Dawn that she kept watching Bambi?
Yes. But it was so interesting because, the whole time, I just knew he got disconnected from his mom and then he found his dad. So, he went with his dad, but I totally missed the gunshot on the movie. And yeah, so it was a really eye-opening experience of just that one small sound really changed my whole perspective of that movie. The story behind it. It was a split-second sound.
You mentioned earlier how things have changed since you were growing up and in college as far as access and resources. What are some of the things that are really have been powerful to advance the access to these offerings?
So I think, technology itself has really come a long ways. There's a lot more opportunities and just different levels of independency, that things that I in the past may have needed to rely on someone. Yes, when I was in high school, any phone call, my mom needed to interpret those calls. So now I have a video phone that I can do that independently. I don't need to depend on anyone. So I think there's a sense of independency. But also on the flip side, with the enhancements of technology, everything, there's new content and there's new technology being created every day. And technology itself can also present barriers for individuals with disabilities. So I think back, physical access to spaces, having elevators in buildings, having ramps, even power doors, all of those things were a really big emphasis when the Americans with Disabilities Act first came out to make sure that individuals had access to physical, locations. But the landscape has changed pretty significantly. We're seeing a lot more technology, a lot more information online and easy access. However, those that use assistive technology, for example, somebody who's blind and using a screen reader, if that online landscape is not accessible, there are barriers there. So technology, there's good stuff, but then there's also bad stuff that comes along the way. So I think that's kind of the shift that we really have taken more recently and where our priority needs to go in terms of making sure that those content creators, they are building in a habit, a daily practice in their work that they're making sure as they're designing and making things that they're making accessible for really anybody who may need to access that information or that product. So I think that's a really important key part today, that technology is just flying. There's new stuff every day, but also at the same time, it's hard to make sure that we are still taking in consideration individuals with disabilities. The great thing, a lot of the accessibility and universal design practices that are happening for accessibility and those with disabilities are great for those without, because a great example, a video with captions, that benefits somebody with a hearing loss. However, if I'm a student in the library and I can't really listen because there's other people around me, I could just follow along with captions. Or maybe I'm just a person, my learning style, I like by hearing and seeing, I can comprehend and retain the information by, multiple means of information being presented. So I think it can be really, really helpful. So I think there's a big shift to the technology world.
Yeah. So in your position here on campus, you have the ability to initiate change in this area. Is there any wishes you have or anything on the horizon that you're thinking, boy, I would love it if we could do this?
I think the accessibility piece of it is a huge part of, we have an accessibility committee on our campus. So accessibility is something that really does require a collective and ongoing effort, and I don't think it'll ever be done because, things evolve so quickly. But I think, the more that we can spread awareness and, really the importance and the benefits of accessibility, I think that we can do that. And sometimes it can be a challenge because we have new people coming and going every day, and I think that we really want to develop a culture on our campus that really focuses on inclusion, diversity, that we're taking in consideration what kinds of best practices really allow students to access all things, on our campus and feel a sense of belonging here. There's no better feeling than showing up at a professional development and there's a video and it's already captioned, it's already turned on. I don't have to do anything special or unique. So if there's anything moving forward, I think if each and every person on our campus can do a little part in really thinking about accessibility, and as they're creating information, it might take a little time, but you're going to cast a wider net of where that information can be accessed and the audience that is going to be using that information. So we'll continue that work with accessibility. The other part of it is more outside our campus, but individuals with disabilities, I do know, oftentimes are still struggling with accessing certain services. That might be maybe human services, health services, but really the Americans with Disabilities Act was written back in, some time ago, that it is really important that people are still interpreting how it was intended to be interpreted. And I think through time, things have changed in our culture and our life that we need to make sure that the law is continuing to move forward as well. And I think that's where the technology piece of it, that yes, individuals with disabilities do need to be able to continue to access those online landscapes, and accessibility is a big piece of that.
You mentioned the ADA, and if I understand the ADA correctly, there are provisions in there that provide more stringent regulations for certain bodies than others. So us in higher ed, we have a fairly high bar that we have to meet. Like all of our educational materials have to be captioned. We just for an example, whereas someone who's in private enterprise, they may not to stick to that. What challenge does that pose for our students and students at any college or university that are approaching their education with a disability that has an accommodation, but then they go out into the world where they may not have those same accommodations universally applied?
That's a really great question. So the ADA, there are definitely various layers with that. And so employers who have X number of employees that work, so larger employers are definitely expected to making sure that they're adhering to the ADA, not, discrimination, and making sure that they're providing accommodations for access. So employers are still, a big part of that, especially larger employers. There's that expectation that they should be working with their employees. I think that's the law side of it, but then there's also the ethical side of it. So if you ask me personally, I think even those smaller businesses, really, the ethical side of it is, you want different ways of approaching things. And if you have people who think and see things the same way in your business, you're not going to be able to get different perspectives. And individuals with disabilities bring those diverse perspectives to the table. And I think that there's rewards and benefits of hiring individuals with disabilities. And so I always really, want to encourage employers to get to know the individual. What strengths, what things can they bring to the table that you feel you might be lacking? And then also, what are the supports and services they may need, in order to do the job, and all the responsibilities that are tied to that job. So there's the legal part, but then there's also, I feel, the ethical part that should be really factored into this as well. But I think in terms of higher education, obviously, with the college receiving federal funds, we are expected, to making sure that we're following the ADA, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. So it is really important from a legal standpoint, but also from the ethical side as well, that, we want to make sure that we're providing opportunity, for students. There's also the public side, so movie theaters, restaurants, there is any goods, services that are offered to the entire public. There is an obligation making sure that there's no discrimination or barriers for those with disabilities as well. So I think, we've got employers, workplace, we've got the public side of things, and then we got the educational, environment. So everyone does have their own legal obligations as well as ethical, with that. And so I always really encourage individuals to think about the ethical side, use that as your foundational point, because really there's great benefits to interacting with individuals with disabilities. And in terms of the workplace, unique perspectives and new information that students have to bring to the table that may not be, considered or thought about previously. So I think that's always something that can be very rewarding for employers and other individuals.
So what do you have going on in your office at the moment? Do you have any projects that you're working towards?
So we have several initiatives that our office is looking at working on. Obviously, we really want to help students find a sense of belonging on our campus. And so we have a program, it's called Allies Lead to Access. So these are students with disabilities who have been identified by our staff who are great at self-advocacy, speaking up for their needs, communicating with others, and they have a really a high level of achievement on our campus. They've made their mark here on campus. They've made impressions, to others. So these students, we actually are looking at doing different programming with these students and helping connect with other students with disabilities to enhance that sense of belonging and empowerment of using services and supports. And, sometimes when you have common ground, you can make some connections to others who really understand what you're experiencing, what you might be going through. So we're really excited about that program. And we have a great group of students who are so motivated and eager to connect with other students. And so we have a lot of really good ideas for new programming moving forward with that. Also, in addition, some other initiatives that we are, really looking at is like our office recently relocated to a new location. A couple of years ago, we changed the name of our office. Our goal was to really try to broaden the scope, making our services more known, more aware. We talked earlier about some individuals just might not realize that our services may be available to them. So we want to get ourselves out there. Me being here at the podcast is a great way to do that, kind of spread that awareness. And I think the more that we, are making our presence known on campus and collaborating with other departments, the more I think we can help with collectively working together to develop that inclusive and welcoming environment on our campus.
Nice. So if someone were interested in getting help, would they just stop in your office? How do students typically reach out to you? Is it email? They swing by? How does that work typically?
So basically, on our website, we are found under the Student Life section. You can find Disability and Access Resources. Any of our contact information, so students or even prospective students, families, they can contact our office through email or phone. We can set up a confidential one-on-one conversation. Sometimes that just helps students, feel a little bit more comfortable, at least in the start, having a direct one-on-one, confidential conversation with our staff who can share, what resources and supports might be available and process to register. That usually involves a two-step process. It is a self-disclosure, which is a form directly on our website that students can identify, I have a disability, here's how it impacts me, here's the type of supports that I might be looking for. The second piece is submitting documentation of their diagnosis, and that might be something they get from their provider, or it may, if they had an IEP when they were in high school, it may be working with their high school and getting that documentation that really describes to us the diagnosis and how it impacts them. So they would follow that two-step process, and we'll help guide, students through that process, especially for students who are just coming from high school. There's a change in how they request services, and some of them never had that experience before. So that's what we're there for. We encourage individuals to reach out and ask questions, and we can guide them through the process and, offer our support wherever we can.
And that's great for Penn College students. We probably have some listeners that are working in a high school situation, guiding students to go off to college. They may or may not be coming to Penn College. Would these types of services and processes be similar across the bulk of colleges and universities?
So I think, in terms of high school students, I usually, explain, whatever college or university that you're going to, really connect with the Disability and Access Resources office that's on the campus. Pretty generally across the board, there is a very similar process, which typically involves identifying, because it's a voluntary process. Students are never required to identify or register. It's voluntary, so there's always some way or form that a student can identify. I am interested in services because I have a disability. And then there usually is the documentation piece that comes along with that. I do encourage, really looking through. A lot of times schools will have guidelines on the specific type of documentation they might need. So I really encourage students to work with their high schools to go back through and look at the information they might have on file to make sure that it's going to meet the needs of what the college or the university might be looking for. For us, we really do need documentation that really tells us how that disability impacts them. Every student's different. So, even if I have documentation for 2 students who have a learning disability in reading, they're still different. For one, it might be more, they might struggle with comprehension. For the other, it might be more reading fluency. So that documentation is a really, really important piece to us to make sure that we're understanding how that diagnosis is impacting the student. That also helps us support the student while they're here. And with self-advocacy, what do you know about your disability? How does it impact you? Sometimes they're not sure how to answer that. So we can use that information to really help them so that they can go out and communicate with their faculty and others on campus, about what their needs might be and best ways to go about doing that. So really within high school, I always talk to during open house or even transition events that we participate in, talking with students who are in high school. If you know you're interested in going on to college, start to work on self-advocacy while you're there. Have a little bit of practice get involved in your IEP team, meetings and lead those meetings, really make sure your voice is known. So I think that that's really an important piece. And then the documentation, because it can take time, especially if you haven't had any evaluation since elementary school. We might need more up-to-date information, and that can take time. So start early, reach out, look at, what's needed, and start that process early so you give yourself enough time.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, I think that's helpful information for any parents who might be listening too.
Absolutely.
I think parents are great at advocating for their children, right? So I think it's a good reminder for any parents listening and faculty too. I mean, if we think about, as Carlos mentioned, just having that top of mind for our faculty or any teachers out there, period, to just keep your eyes open and see those students, and you can identify who maybe needs a little bit of help and be there to support them. So I think those are all great reminders.
Oh, definitely. And I think, it's just receiving accommodations and you want to start day one, ready to go, having, available the resources that you might need. So oftentimes I may talk to families and I have students, I never used accommodations in high school and I don't think I'm going to need them. So I'll just keep you in mind if I need to. And I always still remind them that, by registering with our office, it's there. You get to decide when you need them. So I encourage you to get registered. That way, when you need it, it's ready to go, as opposed to we need a couple of weeks to process that. So timeliness is really essential. And I can tell you, all students, we have 16 weeks in a semester. It moves pretty quickly.
Right.
So, I think, really focusing on your success, starting, from day one, having those resources, on hand when you need them is really crucial.
Yeah, I agree. I think about a couple of the classes that I teach. I teach one that has in-class exams, and so I'll be interested to see how that plays out because I typically haven't had in-class exams, but I've had plenty of students that do approach with accommodations for, say a quiet testing area or 1.5 times, time availability for testing. And I've managed to just rework the courses to, make sure that they're able to do what they can without having to feel that they have to be separated out in any certain way. And I wonder how many faculty might approach that. And do you know how faculty are thinking about their courses in a way that where you mentioned before about having a universal design to a technology, or I'm going to transfer this over to curriculum design or course design, to where it is just it's meeting the needs for everybody.
Definitely. And I think what really has strongly encouraged and pushed more universal design practices is COVID. We shifted to online learning, for a period of time, out of, health and safety for our entire campus community. And I think in turn, it has allowed faculty staff to think about teaching tools and resources that maybe they haven't used in the past. And I do know there are some faculty that have continued those practices, even though they're back in the classroom, but just seeing the benefits of, if I record my class, and make that available for everyone just to be able to re-listen to the lecture, there's benefits to that. If I can go back to a specific part of the class and re-listen, make those connections a little bit easier that didn't happen the first time around when I heard it in class. So I think there's a lot of great benefits that, universal design, that is not just helping students with disabilities, but it's really beneficial to anybody in the classroom. And I think really developing those practices, you're going to be ready, should you have a student who has unique accommodation needs and services, but also at the same time, by using those practices, even if you don't have those students needing those accommodations, you are offering a more solid and well-rounded educational learning environment for all the students in the classroom. So I think that's kind of one thing I always really stress, the importance of universal design and accessibility, that building it into your day-to-day practice really is going to be, there's more benefits than you even imagine, as far as, being able to make sure students with disabilities have access to your materials. It's really, really important that that happens. And I think, it really goes back to that welcoming and inclusive environment. Like something as simple as having a syllabus statement, inviting students to come and talk to you, those open lines of communication can go a long way, understanding exactly, why a student might be struggling with something in your class, communicating directly with that student. We're all unique. So I think learning directly from the student, and that's even something in our office, we learn about disability, accessibility trends from students. That's key. And listening to students and using students' voice to help guide us to practices that we might need to implement. I think that's a really critical piece when it comes to accessibility and, engaging with those that are in your class can be really helpful.
Given that Penn College is a hands-on institution, are there any, you're shaking your head again, yes. So I'm just thinking, what impact does that have on what your office offers?
I think the hands-on learning, I know students that I work with really love that type of learning. And so that's where, we do have specific majors and, the learning environment that we have on our campus really does attract, students who really need that type of learning. So yes, you're going into the lecture, you're learning the theory behind things, but then being able to go into the lab and applying what you're learning, it just really helps with retention and, really just understanding, the theory part of it a lot more because they're able to apply it to real-world scenarios and equipment and tools. And so that's definitely one thing that I know that we do have specific majors and programs and the hands-on learning that really attracts a lot of students. Sometimes, first time I meet with students, what brought you to Penn College? And it oftentimes goes back to the hands-on learning that we have on our campus that is the style of learning that a lot of our students really do benefit from. So it's what makes me really excited about what we have to offer here at Penn College.
I would like to ask you about a final takeaway, but I don't know where we are time-wise, if there's anything we'd like to cover that we haven't covered yet.
I think we're good. And unless there's anything else, Dawn, that you want to bring in before you get to a final takeaway?
My entire life really has been, really impacted on just various levels and my interactions with others, technology that I've used. And so it's something very near and dear to my heart. But I think also there's nothing more rewarding than being able to talk to former students who come back and say, I'm working with the federal government. Here's what I'm doing. And, here's how my experience at Penn College has impacted me in using services and supports. And, we love hearing from, former students. We've had a lot of students who were commencement speakers also having disabilities. And so they've made lasting impressions on not just our office, but others here on our campus. So, so rewarding I love my job. I love working with individuals with disabilities. And I think that there's such great potential. And I love seeing them go out and making their own impact on other people in their lives. And, I think just kind of spread the wealth a little bit, I think that's really something that is very valuable. And I just really, really thoroughly enjoy, the work that I do in disability and access resources. But I think, along with that, a word of a message, really get to know the students, on our campus. So whether you are, working in the front lines, front desk area, and you have students stopping by, or you're a faculty member, or dining services, the more that we get to know our students, the more that we're going to learn from them. I can tell you I learn something new every day. Sometimes students come in, I know artificial intelligence now is just really going through the roof, and I'm hearing students tell me things that I've never heard of, and find myself Googling things. So I look at it as, any opportunity that you can to get to know the students, get to know how you can communicate best with them, what methods of communication work best and more ideal. Some do better with sitting down speaking in person. Some do better with maybe an email where everything's kind of documented for them. So really adapting, and being flexible and comfortable and meeting the needs of our students that we're working with. So get to know students, ask questions, and learn from them. That's what I really encourage, and that's why I use my own disability. Any chance that I have, I'm an open book, so I always tell people, if you have questions about things, don't be afraid to ask. I'm here to, talk to you about what I know and what my experience has been. And, maybe you'll learn something from that, maybe not. But I think the more that we keep those open lines of communications, and we can really learn how we can work best together and support each other.
That's great. Thank you so much. We really appreciate having you here with us today.
Absolutely.
It's been fun.
Yes, I love it. I might need to come back for a second podcast in the future.
Yes.
Definitely.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dawn.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much.
Thanks for hanging out with us today.
Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Check out our show notes for bookmarks to your favorite sections and links to resources that we mentioned in today's episode.
You can also find past episodes and see what's on deck for upcoming ones at pct.edu/podcast.
And of course, we are open to your thoughts, ideas, and suggestions, so send those over at podcast@pct.edu.
It's been real.
Catch you next time.